Mr. Ashford's will was executed 18 months ago. I'll read the relevant sections now.
Take your time, Marcus. We're not in a rush.
To my wife, Diane Ashford, I leave the primary residence on Bellevue Avenue, the vehicles, and 60% of the Ashford Marina Group. To my stepdaughter, Kimberly Reyes, I leave 25% of the Ashford Marina Group and my late father's sailing trophies. To my daughter, Claire Ashford, I leave 15% of the Ashford Marina Group and the contents of the Boathouse.
Well, that's settled then. I know this must be difficult for you, Claire. Your father made his choices. We should all respect that.
That's it. 15%.
There's, one more matter, but we can discuss that another time.
There's nothing else to discuss, Marcus. The will is clear. Oh my God, I cannot believe this.
I want to tell you that I expected it. That somewhere in the back of my mind I had already made peace with being the afterthought in my own father's life. But grief does something strange to memory. It makes you forget every warning sign because you are too busy loving someone to notice them. My name is Claire Ashford, and 3 days before that will was read, I buried my father in a cemetery overlooking the harbor he spent 40 years building a business around. Walter Ashford started with one lease slip and a second-hand boat repair shop. By the time he died, Ashford Marina Group owned 4 marinas along the Rhode Island coastline, a boatyard, and a chandlery that supplied half the sailing clubs in New England. He built all of it with his hands and his stubbornness, and I grew up on the docks beside him, learning to tie a bowline before I learned to ride a bike. My mother left when I was 6. I don't remember much about her, just the smell of her perfume and the sound of the front door closing for the last time. My father raised me alone for 9 years before he met Diane at a charity gala for the yacht club. I was 15. I remember thinking she was beautiful and cold in a way that made me nervous, the way a sky looks right before a storm rolls in off the water. Kimberly was 13 then, quiet, watchful, always a half step behind her mother, learning how to want things. For a while it seemed fine. My father was happy, or at least he said he was. Diane redecorated the house, replaced my mother's old curtains, my grandmother's china, anything that reminded her she was the second wife and not the first. I told myself it didn't matter. Things are just things. What mattered was that my father still took me out on the boat every Sunday, still called me his first mate, still looked at me like I was the reason he got up in the morning. That started to change slowly enough that I couldn't point to the exact day it stopped being true. By the time I was 22, I had a marketing degree and a job offer in Boston, but my father asked me to come work at the marina instead, to learn the business from the ground up, so that someday I could run it. I said yes, without hesitating. I spent the next 7 years learning every part of that company.
Doclices.
Insurance claims. Payroll for 40 employees. I learned how to talk a furious boat owner down from a lawsuit and how to close a deal with a marina supplier twice my age who didn't want to take a woman seriously. I earned every bit of respect I got in that building, and my father used to introduce me to clients as the future of Ashford Marina Group. Diane hated that phrase. I could see it in the tightening of her jaw every time he said it. Kimberly never worked a single day at the marina. She went to a small private college, switched majors twice, and came home after graduation with no job and no plan, and somehow that was fine. Diane called it finding herself. When I asked my father why Kimberly wasn't expected to contribute anything, he told me to be patient with her, that she'd had a harder childhood than I understood, losing her own father to a car accident when she was 7. I felt for her. I did. But sympathy doesn't build a business, and somewhere along the way, sympathy became the excuse for everything Kimberly didn't do, and everything I was expected to keep doing. I remember one board meeting in particular, about 2 years before my father's diagnosis, when Diane sat in on a quarterly review she had no real reason to attend. She spent most of it on her phone until the topic of expanding the boatyard came up, and then she suddenly had opinions, suggesting Kimberly be brought on as a brand and guest relations director, a title that didn't exist anywhere in our org chart until Diane invented it on the spot. My father, to his credit, pushed back gently, saying we'd need to define the role and have Kimberly interview like anyone else. Diane smiled and dropped it, but I remember the look she gave me afterward, like I'd been the one who embarrassed her by simply doing my job well in front of people who mattered. 6 months later, Kimberly got the title anyway. No interview, no job description. She came to the marina office maybe once a week, mostly to sign paperwork someone else had already prepared, and spent the rest of her time posting photos from the yacht club's social events with a company handle tagged. I brought it up to my father once, carefully, because by then I'd learned that criticizing Diane's decisions, even reasonable criticism, put him in a position he hated. He told me Kimberly would grow into it, that everyone needed time to find their footing. I wanted to ask him when I'd been given that kind of time, but I didn't. I just went back to closing deals and reviewing insurance claims and training new dock staff because someone had to actually run the place while people argued about what to call the person who wasn't. Looking back, I think that board meeting was the first time I understood, really understood, that fairness in that family wasn't a shared value. It was a resource, and it went to whoever Diane decided deserved it that week. I didn't resent Kimberly for taking what was handed to her. I resented that no one ever handed me anything. Everything I had, I built with my own 2 hands on those docks, salt water and rope burn and 60-hour weeks, while she got a made-up title and a company credit card. The year before my father got sick, things at the marina started changing in ways I couldn't fully explain. Money moved differently. There were vendor invoices that didn't match what I remembered approving. A boat storage contract with a company I'd never heard of, run by a man named Trent Kowalski, who I later learned had been seen at more than one dinner Diane attended without my father. I brought the discrepancies to my father twice. Both times he told me he'd handle it, that I shouldn't worry, that Diane managed some of the vendor relationships and he trusted her judgment. I let it go because he asked me to, and because 6 weeks later, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and suddenly nothing mattered except keeping him alive. He fought for 11 months. I was at nearly every appointment, every treatment, every hospital stay. Diane was there too, in the beginning, holding his hand for the cameras when the local paper did a piece on his fight, then less and less as the months wore on, and the disease took more of him than it gave back. There were entire weeks near the end when it was just me and the hospice nurse and my father, drifting in and out, while Diane claimed she couldn't handle seeing him that way and stayed home. 3 weeks before he died, on a rare clear afternoon when the medication let him surface long enough to speak in full sentences, my father held my hand and told me something I've replayed in my head every day since. He told me the marina was mine. Not Diane's, not Kimberly's. Meaning, he said he'd made changes to protect it, to protect me, and that everything would be taken care of. He made me promise not to let Diane push me out, no matter what she said or did after he was gone. I promised him I wouldn't. I thought I understood what he meant. I did not understand what he meant. Because 11 days after that conversation, my father slipped into a coma he never woke up from, and by the time we sat in that law office 3 days after his funeral, the man reading his will told me I'd been left 15% of the company I built with my own hands, and a boathouse full of things nobody wanted. I didn't cry in that room. I want you to know that. I sat there, and I listened to Diane thank the attorney like she'd just closed a real estate deal, and I watched Kimberly walk out already planning her lunch, and something inside me went very quiet and very still. Because my father did not break a promise to me. Not without a reason. And Marcus Pratt, sitting behind that desk, had started to say there was one more matter before Diane cut him off like she was afraid of what came next. That fear told me everything I needed to know. The following week, I went back to the house on Bellevue Avenue, the one that was legally Diane's now, to collect the last of my things from my childhood bedroom, which Diane had already started converting into a home gym. Boxes of my old trophies and yearbooks sat stacked by the door like garbage waiting for pickup. I didn't say anything about it. I just carried the boxes to my car in silence while Diane supervised from the kitchen window, sipping coffee like She was watching a chore get done. On my way out, I stopped at the boathouse down by the private dock, the one small piece of property my father had actually left me outright. I hadn't been inside since before he got sick. It still smelled like varnish and salt water, and him. I spent that whole afternoon going through it. Old sailing gear. Photos of us on the boat when I was a kid. A stack of nautical charts he'd marked up over decades. And in the bottom drawer of an old metal filing cabinet he used to keep boat registrations in, underneath a false bottom I only found because the drawer wouldn't sit flush, I found a manila envelope with my name written on the front in his handwriting. Inside was a will, dated 4 months before he died. 4 months after the one Marcus Pratt had read out loud in that office. I sat on the cold concrete floor of that boathouse and read it twice to make sure I wasn't imagining it. This will left me 80% of Ashford Marina Group. It named me sole executor of the estate. It left Diane the house and a modest fixed sum, nothing tied to the business. It left Kimberly nothing at all beyond a small personal item, my grandmother's sailing trophies, which ironically was the one thing given to Kimberly in the will Marcus had read. Attached to it was a letter, handwritten, my father's shaking script near the end when the disease had started taking his fine motor control. He wrote that he'd learned, only months before his diagnosis, that Diane had been quietly funneling company funds through a shell logistics company run by Trent Kowalski, a man she'd been involved with for over 2 years. He wrote that the vendor discrepancies I'd flagged were real, that Diane had been draining nearly $400,000 from the marina's operating accounts over 18 months, and that when he confronted her, she threatened to make his final months a public spectacle, dragging their marriage through the papers while he was too sick to fight it, unless he agreed to let her manage things quietly and give her time to pay it back. He wrote that he was ashamed he let fear of a scandal and fear of dying alone without Diane by his side keep him from acting immediately. But he wrote that he had a plan. He'd had this second will drafted in secret, using an attorney outside the firm Diane knew, someone he trusted completely, a man named Arthur Chen who had handled some of his personal contracts for years. He wrote that the will Diane and Marcus knew about was an older one, from before he discovered the theft, and that he had instructed Arthur to hold the true will and only release it if I came looking, because he suspected Diane would try to have the earlier version presented first while he was too weak to stop her, and he needed proof I'd find this on my own, that I wasn't being handed anything, that I'd earned the right to know the truth the same way I'd earned everything else in that company. He also wrote something else, something that broke me more than any of the financial details. He wrote that he was sorry. Sorry for the years he let Diane's excuses cover for Kimberly's absence at the company. Sorry for every time he told me to be patient instead of standing up for what was fair. He wrote that watching me build a career out of sheer will while he stayed quiet was the greatest regret of his life, and that this will was the only way he knew how to make it right before he ran out of time. I sat in that boathouse until it got dark outside, holding a letter from a dead man asking me to fight a battle he didn't have the strength to finish himself. The next morning, I called the number for Arthur Chen listed on the letterhead. He remembered my father immediately. He confirmed everything. He'd been holding the original signed will in a secure file for 11 months, under strict instruction not to contact anyone unless I reached out first. He told me my father had come to his office alone, in a wheelchair, insisting on signing the document himself despite how weak he'd become, because he wanted no question about his mental competency or his intent. Arthur agreed to meet with Marcus Pratt and me together. He also mentioned something that turned my stomach. He said my father had asked him to quietly begin an audit of the marina's accounts the same week he signed the new will, an audit that Arthur had continued discreetly even after my father's death, funded through a small trust my father set aside specifically for that purpose, one Diane didn't know existed because it wasn't tied to any account she had access to. That audit was almost finished, and it showed the $400,000 was only the beginning. 2 weeks later, we sat in Marcus Pratt's office again, except this time it was me, Arthur Chen, a forensic accountant named Priya Nair who'd completed the audit, and Marcus himself, who looked like a man being handed a grenade with the pin already pulled. Diane and Kimberly were asked to attend, told only that there was a matter regarding the estate that required their presence. Diane walked in wearing the same confident posture from 3 weeks earlier. She sat down across from me and smiled the way you smile at someone you've already decided has lost. She assumed this was about finalizing transfer paperwork. Marcus cleared his throat and slid a folder across the table, the twin of the one he'd read from before, except this one had never been opened in front of Diane. He explained that my father had executed a subsequent will 4 months before his death, and that this document superseded the one read at the prior meeting. He asked Arthur to explain, since Arthur had been the attesting attorney. Diane's smile didn't move for almost a full 10 seconds, like her face hadn't caught up to what her ears had just heard. She insisted that wasn't possible, that she would have known. Arthur told her plainly that she wasn't meant to know. That was Walter's explicit instruction. I watched something crack behind Diane's eyes. Kimberly looked between her mother and the folder, confused, like she was still waiting for someone to explain the joke. Priya opened her own file next and laid out 18 months of financial records on the table, wire transfers to a shell company registered to Trent Kowalski, invoices for services that were never rendered, and a pattern of withdrawals timed suspiciously close to Diane's known travel with him. $412,000, all told, moved out of company accounts while my father was too sick to check the books himself. Diane tried to claim it was a misunderstanding, that Trent's company had provided consulting. Priya asked her calmly, consulting for what? There were no deliverables associated with any of the payments. No contracts, no work product, nothing filed with the state. Just wire transfers. Diane's voice climbed higher, sharper, the kind of tone I recognized from every argument she'd ever lost in that house. She insisted Walter had approved every one of those transactions. Arthur corrected her. Walter had written a letter, attached to the will, explaining he had not approved them, that he'd discovered them after the fact, and that Diane had threatened him with a public divorce scandal during his cancer treatment if he exposed her before he had time to protect the company. He'd documented dates, conversations, and his intent to have the matter formally investigated after his death, which was exactly what had been happening for the last 11 months. The room went silent in a way I'd never experienced before. Not the tense silence of a family fighting. The silence of someone realizing the ground under them had been quietly removed months ago, and they were only now starting to fall. Kimberly finally spoke, and for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded like an actual scared 29-year-old woman instead of someone playing a part. She asked her mother what he was talking about. Diane told her to be quiet. Kimberly asked again, louder this time. Diane didn't answer her daughter. She turned back to me instead, and for one brief moment, the mask fully slipped, and I saw exactly what my father must have seen in his final year of life. She told me I thought I'd won something, that I thought a piece of paper changed what I was in this family. I told her I wasn't trying to win anything. I was trying to honor what my father actually wanted, which was apparently something she'd spent 18 months trying to steal from him while he was dying. She didn't have a response to that. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady, the voice of a man doing the part of his job he actually respected. He said that given the evidence presented and the forensic findings, he'd be formally submitting the new will for probate as the operative document, effective immediately. He strongly recommended Diane retain independent counsel, as the estate would likely pursue recovery of the misappropriated funds, and given the amounts involved, this might extend beyond a civil matter. Diane stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. She didn't say another word. She walked out of that office the same way she'd walked out 3 weeks earlier, except this time there was no confidence in it at all, just the fast, tight steps of someone who knows exactly how much trouble they're actually in. Kimberly didn't follow her right away. She sat there for a moment, looking at me, and something passed between us that wasn't quite an apology, but wasn't nothing either. She told me she hadn't known. She swore she hadn't known any of it. I believed her. I still do. Kimberly was raised inside her mother's excuses the same way I was raised inside my father's business, and neither of us fully chose the family we grew up navigating. I told her I believed her, and I meant it, but I also told her that not knowing doesn't erase what happened, and that she was old enough now to decide who she wanted to be going forward, separate from her mother's choices. She left without saying much else. The months that followed were not simple. The investigation into Diane's finances expanded once Priya's audit was formally submitted, and it turned out Trent Kowalski had done this before, with at least one other older, sick, trusting man 2 decades earlier, whose family never fully understood why their father's savings quietly disappeared before he died. Diane eventually settled a civil claim with the estate, returning a portion of the funds under threat of criminal referral, though I understand from Marcus that the matter with the district attorney's office is still open. Kimberly moved out of the Bellevue house within 2 months and, from what I hear through mutual acquaintances at the yacht club, took a job at a small design firm in Providence, the first job she's held longer than 4 months in her adult life. I don't know if that means anything changed for her. I hope it does. I hope somewhere in this, she got the chance my father never had, to see clearly before it was too late. As for me, I run Ashford Marina Group now. All 4 locations, the boatyard, the chandlery, everything my father built with a lease slip and a stubborn refusal to quit. I kept the old dock hands who'd worked with him for 20 years, men who taught me to splice line and read weather off the color of the sky before any app could tell you the same thing. I framed the letter he wrote me and hung it in my office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what it costs to stay quiet when something is wrong, and what it takes to finally stop. One of the first things I did as owner was eliminate the brand and guest relations position Diane had invented for Kimberly. Not out of spite, but because it never should have existed in the first place, and keeping it on the books felt like keeping a small piece of the old dishonesty alive. I used part of that saved budget to start an apprenticeship program instead, bringing on 2 local kids straight out of high school to train as marine technicians, the same kind of opportunity my father gave dockhands decades ago, when nobody else would take a chance on them. The first apprentice we hired, a 19-year-old named Josh who used to hang around the boatyard asking questions until someone finally gave him a job, reminds me a little of myself at that age, hungry to prove he belonged somewhere. Arthur Chin still handles some of the estate's ongoing legal matters, and he told me once, almost in passing, that my father used to talk about me during their meetings, not about the business, just about me, the daughter who showed up every single day whether anyone noticed or not. I didn't know that until after he was gone. I wish I hadn't needed a stranger to tell me. I still think about Kimberly sometimes, wondering if the version of her that existed before her mother's excuses became a shield might have turned out differently in a fairer house. I don't carry anger toward her anymore. I carry it toward the years that were wasted proving to 2 women that I deserved a seat at a table I'd already built with my own hands. Some Sundays, when the harbor is calm and the light comes in low over the water the way it used to when I was small, I take the boat out alone, the same one he taught me to sail on. I don't need anyone to tell me anymore what 15% of a life is worth, or what it means to be someone's afterthought. I know what I'm worth. My father made sure of that, even from the boathouse floor, even after he was gone. And that is worth more to me than any percentage a smiling woman ever read out loud in a lawyer's office, thinking she'd already won.